Hello again. Just like in the last segment, one of the things that I'm hoping to do in this video segment is to really kind of make writing this paper a little bit more approachable for you. I realize that this is a difficult topic to really kind of undertake. It's not as straightforward maybe as the question that I asked you in paper one. But in any case, what I'm going to do in this particular instance is kind of give you the historical backdrop. We've talked about it, but they've kind of been snippets in our class up until this point, and I want to bring those little pieces out and kind of magnify them so that you can kind of see where Richard Wright is coming from in this particular novel. I want to start out with the institution that is the Communist Party. Um, the late 1930s and early 1940s are probably the most successful time period in terms of the history of the American Communist Party. And the reason for that is not necessarily because people were buying into their philosophy of communist revolution, but because they more or less abandoned the idea of worldwide communist revolution, overthrowing governments and the like, and adopted a policy of working with other people for things that were really popular, and by popular I mean populist in American life. Labor unions, for example, issues involving equality, civil rights would be another very good example. And so this is going to attract more and more people to the party during this time period. But before I go any further, let me point out, and I've said this in class before, but just so we're clear, it was the Communist Party that was the only predominantly white institution, really from its inception, that made a meaningful commitment to civil rights reform. Time and again, what the Communist Party in the late 20s, early 30s, throughout the 1930s would say is, we believe in the self-determination of the Black Belt. In other words, we believe that African Americans should enjoy the full benefits and rights of citizenship, and that doesn't matter what white America has to say about it. Okay? Um, Now, you can debate the merits of how committed the communists were. Like anybody else, they have an agenda, and like anybody else, a lot of times that agenda is selfish. But you can see cases here and there with respect to what I'm talking about. Probably the best case, and certainly one that lends itself most similarly to what you got going on in Native Son, would be the example of Scottsboro. Keep in mind that it was those 9 Scottsboro African American boys that they really were young men that were accused of raping those 2 white girls while they rode the trains in Alabama. Now, again, we're talking about Alabama in the 1930s, and just the accusation of rape alone had some pretty serious consequences. Okay, and I'm sure you can use your imagination based on your understanding of Richard Wright. It is the Communist Party that sends its legal resources through the International Labor Defender to Alabama that ultimately provides the pro bono free legal resources that ultimately ends in a hung jury. I mean, this is a huge, huge victory considering you're talking about a group of people whose fate was almost decided, much like Bigger Thomas, before that court even opened session. Okay. Um, the other thing that I think is helpful to keep in mind here is some of your readings. I've given you a laundry list of things that we've talked about in class, and you can find those events, for example, like the Sacco and Vanzetti trial or the race riots of 1919 in Chicago, this idea of a new Negro attitude that you'll see both in the post-World War I and World War II eras. But what I want to talk about right now is ways that you can pull in readings from your sources for America's history. Um, right underneath those events and issues in the paper to prompt, you see another laundry list that lists the readings and their corresponding page numbers that I think would be helpful if I were writing this paper. And so, for example, on page 409, you see this document that's talking about the Catholic threat to American politics. The 1840s and 50s, what you see are a lot of Irish Catholic immigrants coming over for a lot of reasons, but the potato famine is really gripping Ireland, and they're more or less forced out. There's a lot of people, and when Jack Kennedy ran for president in 1960, he had to discuss this issue of his Irish Catholic heritage. A lot of people that believe that Catholic people can't really be loyal American citizens because their first loyalty is to the Pope in Rome. And so there's that ethnic prejudice. If you were to read The Persistent and Violent Racism Against African Americans, located on page 471, you can see that, first of all, there was no detail that was spared with respect to the segregation of the races. And secondly, it wasn't really the legal system that upheld the system of segregation, it was violence. And understand that if you have children and they happen to be of the racial ethnic minority background, if you want them to survive into adulthood, you need to explain to them and get them to understand what it means to behave like a African American man, for example. One of the things that you could just not do is you could not look at a white woman. You couldn't look her in an eye. It's not a coincidence that Bigger Thomas feels very uncomfortable around Mary and does not like, nor does he appreciate her strange questions, or at least in his mind, strange questions in the presence of a white man, her father no less. Anyway, you've got the Condemned Radical Protest Political Hysteria located on page 549. Now, we were talking about the Sacco and Vanzetti trial earlier in the semester, and if you remember, in 1920, both Sacco and Vanzetti are put on trial, not necessarily because the state has some sort of smoking gun evidence against them. That trial is more about their connections to radicalism, in their case, anarchism, to be specific. But nonetheless, you can see some really pure biases when it comes to radical philosophies. Japanese Americans in the Crosshairs of War on page 600 talks about Japanese internment and how Americans viewed not only the Japanese as this group that was a perpetual foreigner, a perpetual outsider that could never really become American, but also how that there was something sinister about this and how they were targeted based on their race and ethnicity. You've got the fight for democracy and civil rights at home and abroad. That is in page 601 that talks about how African Americans participate in the war effort and how this really, led them to believe that if here I am sacrificing everything abroad to fight Hitler abroad, I should have first-class citizenship rights at home. Um, One of my really favorite topics in American history is the speech that Fannie Lou Hamer gave in 1964 from the floor of the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City. You can get a snippet of that speech on page 677, and that speech that she gives is this America? She's questioning, is this America? Is Mississippi America, where I have to sleep with the phone off the hook at night because I'm afraid that if people get wind of what I'm doing, which is nothing more than registering people to vote, I'm going to be murdered. I'll disappear in the middle of the night. So she really questions America to take a deep, close look inward in itself. Maybe the document that might make the most sense when it comes to you understanding, how to approach this paper is going to come from Malcolm X on page 680. The civil rights movement takes a more militant turn. Um, I don't think it's a secret that Malcolm X preached a much more fiery brand of civil rights activism than Martin Luther King, who was talking about turning the other cheek and, integration and his dream of one day his children being judged on the content of the character instead of the color of their skin. Um, it's not necessarily that Malcolm X is just more radical. In a lot of ways, MLK is more radical than Malcolm X. But the rhetoric that he uses, the idea of using violence or responding to violence with violence, it doesn't get much more, direct when it comes to, the hate that hate produced. As a matter of fact, in the late 1950s, there was, I believe it was CBS that produced this documentary entitled The Hate That Hate Produced. And it was a documentary on the rise of the Nation of Islam, which in addition to being the leading spokesgroup, organization for black separation, was the organization that Malcolm X had belonged to, and really kind of opened his eyes, especially after he had gone to prison, with respect to race relations in the United States and the role that violence played in those. Okay, so take a look at those readings and use them to couple up some of the themes and issues that you've got going on in the story, in the story of Bigger Thomas. One easy connection that you can make is, the story of Sacco and Vanzetti and radicalism in the middle of this Red Scare in the 19 teens and early 20s, with how the prosecution comes at the Communist Party and the International Labor Defender in the trial, or the role that communism and communists play throughout much of the story of Native Son. That's an easy connection, as is a Southern Girl's introduction to racism. There's clear issues of violence that you can couple with, the world that Bigger Thomas had grown up in. So it's important that you understand it's not a book report. What I'm trying to get you to do in answering this question, and it should be your own personal interpretation. Again, I said, think of yourself as somebody that's sitting on this jury and listening to both sides present their case. I think it would be best if you bring as many pieces of information into your discussion as possible, because when you do that, what you're doing is you're adding depth, detail, and context to your evidence and analysis, and most importantly, you're illuminating the idea that although this is fiction, Native Son is essentially fiction, there's an awful lot of truth to what Richard Wright is talking about in terms of the context involving civil rights and the lack of civil rights reform. I hope that this has been helpful. I realize that we're having this paper later on in the semester, and it's not as black and white of a question as what paper 2 was, but ultimately this book and this question is really going to make you think. It's going to be a lot more difficult than simply saying yes or no, as far as understanding civil rights, race relations, and the role that inequality has played in our society in the 20th century. In any case, I hope it was helpful. If not, you know how to find me. Good luck.